Hi everyone. In this brief video, we're going to talk about ecological systems theory with implications for instruction. So first of all, you have to understand that we're dealing with different systems from interaction within the family to interaction with teachers on up through overall society that influence your identity and influence the learning. For instance, you start with the microsystem. Microsystem deals with the child's family, close relations that the child interacts with every day at school, peer groups, neighborhood friends, the very, very closest of deepest interactions that the child has. And this is what shapes the child the deepest. Then, as we further look into the microsystem, you have to understand that oftentimes you can have functional or you can have dysfunctional aspects with the family, and this, of course, deeply influences the child on a social, emotional level. Language and communication deeply influences identity work and learning and meaning making of a child. Next, we deal with the mesosystem. The mesosystem is the next highest system beyond the microsystem. The teachers at the school, for instance, but teachers that you don't necessarily interact with on a daily basis, maybe not your homeroom teacher if you're a young child with homeroom, for instance, but teachers that you do see, just not your regular classroom teachers that you might spend an hour or two with. Maybe the principal, for instance, you don't have regular interaction with the principal on a daily basis, possibly, but the principal would be part of the mesosystem, and the principal would still have a deep connection with the immediate environment. So, for instance, the mesosystem deals with factors close into the child's life that deeply impact the child's microsystem, principles, peer groups that deeply impact the child's microsystem. Next, we've got the exosystem as we move further out. The exosystem consists of things that indirectly impact the child, such as, for instance, the parent's workplace. For instance, let's take me. Now, you guys know that I'm not a father. I've got mixed emotions about that, of course. But if I did have a child, my work environment that I'm in would deeply impact my child, of course. If a parent is in a positive work environment, then that can potentially influence the microsystem of a child in some pretty significant ways, possibly, because maybe the parent comes home feeling more positive. Maybe the parent comes home feeling more relaxed. Maybe it's the type of work environment that doesn't demand 100 hours a week or whatever. Um, on the other hand, if a parent is in a toxic work environment with all kinds of stress and pressure and long work hours and so on and so forth, that can potentially ideally, it shouldn't. You always would think that hopefully a parent would have better self-control, but let's face it, it can potentially have a negative impact on a child's microsystem if a parent is in a very toxic work environment. And the child doesn't know anything about all that stuff. The child doesn't even understand all of that stuff. But it does have an impact. So that's why I would say that a parent's workplace is a very important part of the exosystem for a child. Of There's some various factors within the exosystem that can impact a child. Socioeconomic status of a family, the earning, the family, that impacts home life, stability of the home, all that stuff deeply impacts the child. Whether the parent or parents are steadily employed or unemployed, for instance. And like I said, the quality of that employment. There's more to quality of employment than money. You can make what, $500,000 a year, but still be in a toxic work environment, and therefore it would have a negative impact. On the other hand, you can make what, $35,000 a year or 30,000 or 50,000 or whatever. Um, but if you're in a positive work environment and it's stable and you can provide for your family, then that has a positive impact on your child. It's not all about money here, but all these things deeply impact the neighborhood that a child lives in, whether the neighborhood is safe or noisy or there's threats of crime and all that stuff. It deeply impacts the child in many, many ways. Then we deal with the macro system. The macro system would be the larger context in which the child lives. For instance, the culture. Are we talking about Eastern culture, Western culture writ large, which can be broken down, of course? What nationality does the child identify with and the family identify with? The political culture and subculture, all this stuff deeply impacts the child. And within a neighborhood, does that child identify as immigrant? Does that child identify as lifelong Arkansan? Does that child identify as Chinese American or Native Chinese or whatever? All that stuff deeply impacts the child's sense of identity. As you can see, all of this stuff is very interrelated. And in this diagram that you can see in front of you, you might even, instead of seeing solid lines separating mesosystem, microsystem, and all that, maybe you can even think of dotted lines here instead, because all of these things are very, very much interrelated. They interact with one another, these systems. So, as we deal with our sense of identity, our sense of who we are as we're growing up as children, all of these things very much will change because you also have to think of what's thought of as the chronosystem. The chronosystem would be change over time because it's possible that your immediate environment or the mesosystem, exosystem, all this stuff could potentially change over time. Uh, Take me with my life. As you guys know, hypothetically, if I had been a father over the years, let's say hypothetically that I had a child when I was in my 20s, but my life followed the same path that it has followed in this hypothetical world, then you're talking about potentially a child moving from Florida to South Carolina to St. Louis to um, Little Rock. And all those moves can impact the child. That's impacting exosystem, that's impacting mesosystem, the various work environments that I've been in, whether it's University of Arkansas Little Rock or whether it was my previous university, Arizona State University in St. Louis, or previous K through 12 schools, Seminole High School in Sanford, Florida, or North Star High School in, which is now closed, but North Star High School in Orlando, Florida, working in Seminole County Public Schools when I was in Central Florida, or Orange County Public Schools when I was in Central Florida before I joined higher education, or living in South Carolina with Clemson University. All of that stuff that impacts the child. Think of my childhood, and the changes I've been through from what you guys know. You know, First 8 years of my life, Idaho, with my parents identifying with a particular church that they attended. I tend not to get specific about that because religion gets potentially sensitive. But and close to my grandparents and family and spending a lot of time with them and identifying as a little bit on the rural side because I loved spending time with my grandmother and on my grandmother's farm and so forth. So there's that and loving nature, loving hikes during my first 8 years. That you can see how all that stuff impacted. And then we moved out to Klamath Falls, Oregon. All of a sudden, when I was 8, all of a sudden, some pretty significant changes in these systems, and it impacted change over time when I was at age 8. All of a sudden, a little bit less stable, to be honest. I didn't spend as much time around my grandparents. Um, we had a very different type of home, honestly, a downsize. And all that stuff impacts different sets of friends. Um, and then Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, when I was 9 years old. Uh, Talk about a change, attending, even though I'm not Jewish, but attending a private Jewish school during my nearly 4 years in Pittsburgh, which deeply influenced me. So I was actually attending two different types of churches. And so now again, religion is part of these systems. I'm just not being all that specific about me, about myself there, for obvious reasons. This being recorded, and I don't know you guys well enough to know just how that sensitive that is with some of you. But all of a sudden, exposure to different cultures, diversity. To be very honest, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was the first time in my life that I was spending extended amounts of time around non-white, populations, people of color, and people of varied religious beliefs that differed from my parents' home religious beliefs. So I went and exposure to arts and art museums, and of course the sports of Pittsburgh. And if you want to look up, the because I know some locations have a particular identity that goes with that, and Pittsburgh has a very idiosyncratic sense of identity that I took on. It's a little bit of a, blue collar tough. You've heard of the phrase Boston strong. Well, there's Pittsburgh strong, and so all that identity uh, came with it, that influenced me. Then Central Florida, when I was nearly 13, another change. Again, Central Florida, new friends, diversity, uh, significant changes, an upgrade in living conditions. That's part of why we moved to Central Florida, in terms of quality of home in which we were living. And so all of that stuff impacted me. And so you can see significant changes over time, that I went through, and that's true for whatever child you're talking about is going through changes over time, possible changes in the home environment. And if you don't know anything about what a child is going through, then you won't understand all of these factors that are potentially influencing a child. I went through a little bit of a rebellious phase when I was in middle school because, for one thing, I loved Pittsburgh. I absolutely fell in love with living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania when I was a child. And so moving to Sanford, Florida, near Orlando, I was I was an angry young child when we first moved there. I hated Central Florida at first. I don't hate it now, but at first I hated it because I wanted to go back to Pittsburgh. And so, that would have confused my teachers possibly because I was acting up. Um, I was acting up pretty. I was definitely not a well-behaved middle schooler for a little while there. The teachers didn't necessarily understand all of these factors, missing my friends, missing things to do in Pittsburgh, missing the sports, missing the museums, missing so much that I felt was lacking. And so that impacted me, and that goes toward understanding your children in terms of presence, in terms of being able to teach them. If a teacher had understood these emotions that I was going through when I was a middle school student, uh, feeling upset, feeling kind of frankly lonely, uh, feeling angry, feeling kind of deprived of things that I wanted, feeling a sense of my very identity I felt had been shaken when I moved from Pittsburgh. And remember, my point isn't so much me, because who cares about me when you teach, but think about what your own students might be going through when you teach. Um, my sense of who I am got very wrapped up into this Pittsburgh sense of identity when I was a child. And then all of a sudden, Now what? And so I was doing little things that wouldn't have made sense to people around me in Florida. For instance, when it got to be 40 degrees in Florida or 35 degrees in Florida, and it doesn't get that cold in Florida, honestly. It I would refuse to wear a jacket, and people around me would look at me like, "What in the world?" And I'm thinking to myself, "Okay, I'm Pittsburgh. I don't need to wear a jacket." Type of thing. This isn't cold. You want to know cold? Try 15 degrees below zero, and attending a football game in 15 degrees below zero, or playing football without a jacket in 15 degrees below zero. What are you guys doing wearing jackets at 35 degrees? That and it's silly. But that was my mindset as a middle school student, right? And I played piano when I was in Pittsburgh. I took piano lessons from a university professor at Carnegie Mellon University, and then all of a sudden the piano teachers I was maybe a little bit of a middle school snob. I was feeling angry because it was tough for a piano teacher that I had in Florida to measure up to this Carnegie Mellon University professor of music. And so all of a sudden I was rebelling and I was walking out and refusing to practice piano and all that stuff. I needed a little bit of understanding. And all of this stuff impacted. Now, obviously, I turned out okay, but what I'm telling you is that there can be all kinds of stuff related to these chronosystems and mesosystems and what's going on in the home. Notice I'm not getting too into detail about my parents' jobs and all that stuff. That's a little bit private, but I will say this: my mother is, or was, she passed away in 2013, August 2013. But my mother was a lifelong librarian. My father was a social worker who, in Central Florida, eventually started teaching college at Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona, Florida. That tells you a little something, but it doesn't tell you the whole thing. There's a lot more to the story than that. But all of that stuff, the ups and downs of whatever my parents went through, it's a little bit private. That impacted me too. Social work can be a stressful profession when you're dealing with challenging situations. So all that goes toward what impacted me as a within my microsystem, right? So, in a healthy ecology, ideally you might have bonded caregivers, you might have positive discipline, supportive teachers, supportive classroom learning environment. But when something goes awry within this ecology, then it can impact the child in some pretty deep ways. And of course, the chronosystem interacts with all of these other systems to deal with change over time. Think of how these various systems that I was just describing within my own life interacted within the chronosystem that is change over time, as I went through some pretty significant changes over time. By the time I was 18, living in Central Florida, uh, people who might have known me when I was 7 in Idaho, I had gone through so many significant changes beyond just simply the fact that I was older. I had gone through so many things within these various systems that also influenced me in profound ways. That it was kind of, I found that by the time I was 18, it was kind of hard to even begin to explain these changes to my relatives out in Idaho. So all that impacts the child, and it's important for you to consider too. So as we think about this, think of what this means about self-identity. And there's a reason why I've been talking a little bit about myself here, because I want you to think about your own self-identity here, self-reflect. And I also want you to think about how all of these various systems can interact to form the child's, in any of your classrooms, your child's sense of identity. And in many approaches to education, whether we're talking about an approach called funds of knowledge or others, but especially when we get into sociocultural approaches to education. Um, there's a great deal of interlapping between the socio-cultural approaches to education and these ecological approaches to education. Because remember, when you study socio-cultural and constructivist approaches to education, socio-cultural learning theory is basically, in a nutshell, the idea that if you're going to understand um, how learning takes place within the child, yeah, you have to understand the functioning of the mind and all that. There's no denying the physical neurological aspect of learning, but it's also important to understand the role that social interaction plays and the role that culture plays and the way that the cultured nature of language plays. Because remember, every word we speak has a cultural basis behind it. So and ecological systems deal with, of course, social interaction, cultural interactions. And so there's a huge interlapping um, between ecological systems and sociocultural learning theory when you study that. And generally speaking, people who are proponents of sociocultural learning theories also are proponents of keeping in mind the ecological aspects of learning too. For instance, there is an approach called funds of knowledge. In the funds of knowledge approach, influenced by Paulo Freire and others, Louis Moll, in the funds of knowledge approach, you want to get to know something about the child as well as the child's family and neighborhood and so forth. And you operate under the assumption that instead of thinking of the child's home and background and environment as something deficit, you think of it as something positive, and you operate under the assumption that there might be and are strengths and funds of knowledge, bank of knowledge there within the family and neighborhood and background knowledge of the child that you can learn about and tap into and integrate into your own teaching and use that to draw upon the child's background knowledge to inform connections that the child makes to new academic learning material and help you to ensure that the child finds your academic material meaningful and useful by the fact that you are connecting new academic material with these funds of knowledge that the child holds from background experiences and home life and these mesosystems and microsystems, right? And then, of course, understand self-concept, which is this kind of mental conception that we build, this story that we tell of who we are, that is shaped by and changed by these systems with which we interact. And understanding the self-conception of your students will help you to reach and teach your students. So, of course, physical, psychological, social attributes all play a role in influencing habits, beliefs, and ideas about who you are as an individual. And of course, the key implication I want you to draw from this is that it's important to keep in mind the systems in which the person interacts in order to understand um, how can you connect with your child? How can you make learning meaningful for your child? Um, and again, like I said, I don't want you to think of these learning theories as you learn about them. I don't want you to think of them as interactive. I want you to think about how can they connect and how can they inform your teaching. The bottom line of how ecological approaches will inform your teaching is that you want to take in mind the ecology in which your children live and interact and how that can inform your teaching. Okay, hope you enjoyed this. Take care.